Friends, thanks for joining us for the final episode in our Help Out series, When We Need to Reach Out. How appropriate it is at the end of 2020 that we reach out.
Hey everyone, welcome to the E2 Effective Elders podcast. E2 is devoted to coaching your elder team to win by providing biblical and practical resources in authentic relationships. E2 wants nothing more than to equip you to move God's kingdom forward in the place you're serving Jesus. Visit us at e2elders.org and please share this good word with others.
Hey, thanks friends for joining us for yet another episode of our E2 podcast, and our thanks to CDF Capital for making it all possible. We are in the fifth and final episode of this mini-series called Help Out. We find ourselves in the Christmas season, and not everyone is singing joy to the world. As a matter of fact, it is a weary world for many a people. A few weeks ago, as we started this series, we noted that Carey Nieuwhof made mention of a pretty sad statistic. 7 out of 10 pastors are on the verge of quitting. 70% of ministers today in America are ready to throw in the towel. And then, making matters worse, Barna made mention that in August of this year, ministers rated their mental health glaringly low. 50%, 1 out of 2 pastors said that their mental health was anywhere from poor to only average. These are difficult days. It's been a tough year. We're ready for 2020 to be in the rearview mirror. A friend of mine said that he typically doesn't stay up for New Year's Eve, but this year he is, because he's not going to welcome a new year. He's going to make sure that 2020 leaves. That's his sentiment. And that might be your sentiment as well. What we're discovering is that this is a time when we can help people out. We can help out, particularly when people want to walk out. That you and I, we can help out when people are on the verge of a burnout. That you and I can help out as we teach people how to hold out. You and I, we can help out when we determine that we will call out in prayer to God. But today, in this fifth and final episode, you and I can help out in a most practical way as we encourage people to reach out. And you'll see what I mean by that in just a moment as we get into the text. Now, storms are a very real part of life. As a matter of fact, as we think of literal storms, this has been, unsurprisingly, a record year. For example, the Weather.com site said that another record has been set. Hurricanes. The hurricane season goes from June the 1st until November the 30th. And during this year's hurricane season, there have been a record 30 named storms. But storms don't happen only in a literal sense in terms of the weather. Storm surge has been happening in a very real way in yet many other arenas of life. For example, storms have raged medically. This morning, I heard that yesterday a record was set in America with over 3,100 COVID-related deaths, 3,100 in a single day. Medically, there are people who are experiencing one storm after another, and it's not all pandemic related. And not only medically, but financially, there have been many storms. And again, not only COVID related. Yes, because of COVID, tens of millions of Americans are unemployed. Tens of thousands of businesses have closed. The National Restaurant Association today announced that 110,000 restaurants are closed in America, and the majority of them are permanently closed. Again, because of COVID. Financially, America is struggling in a sea of red ink. Our national debt is skyrocketing. So financially, there are storms that are raging. Maritally, many people are struggling because of COVID and other related instances, financial pressures and whatnot. There are a number of marriages in crisis. Emotionally, people are in a state of despair, discouragement, and again, much of it as an outcome of COVID. The point is, this pandemic has been the icing on the cake to cause a storm surge in many different arenas of life, including that of ministry in the local church. It may be that you are an elder. It may be that you are on the ministry staff team of a church. It may be that you are a volunteer. And for whatever reason, you're finding yourself at the end of this year spent. And there are storms that are raging. Well, you and I want to remember that in this very brief series, we've been looking at the Apostle Paul. We've deliberately looked in the New Testament at this man's life and realized that not only was he often able to help others out, but there were moments when he needed some help in his life. We noted in our first episode that Paul may have wanted to walk out. We were in Acts, and we were looking from Acts chapter 16 on, that there were moments in Paul's life when he became exhausted. And in Acts chapter 18, the Lord appears to him in a vision, telling him, do not stop speaking, don't quit. Could it have been that Paul was on the verge of walking out, throwing in the proverbial towel? We noted that there were moments in Paul's life when he was on the verge of a burnout. He was so wounded. There were moments in Paul's life when he was determined to hold out, when he declared in the second letter to the church at Corinth that though he was struggling, he was not crushed. Though he was being struggling with despair, he was not destroyed. He said, though outwardly we are wasting away, inwardly we are being renewed day by day, for our light and momentary troubles are achieving for us an eternal glory that far outweighs them all. So Paul was determined to hold out. In our last episode, we talked about how Paul was determined to cry out, pray without ceasing, he wrote. Now, in this last episode, we're going to look at a moment in Paul's ministry path in his life when he was determined to reach out. Paul is literally going to be caught in a storm. We're going to look at a storm text in Scripture where Paul was experiencing the need to reach out. In Acts chapter 27, Paul is in a storm. Now here's the context before we get into the content. Earlier, Paul is arrested in Jerusalem. There's a death threat that Paul receives. He gets word that some Jews want to kill him. And so the Roman centurion sends Paul to Caesarea by the sea, along the Mediterranean Sea, in order to save his life from possible assassination. And Paul here is standing trial then in Caesarea. He appears before kings and magistrates, and in one of those moments, Paul makes this statement. He says, I appeal to Caesar. He, being a Roman citizen, makes an appeal to Caesar, and the king in that moment says, to Caesar you have appealed, then to Caesar you will go. And that puts Paul then on a prison ship. And he's on his way from Caesarea along the Mediterranean Sea to Rome. And it's during that journey that Paul finds himself caught in a literal storm. So there's the context. Now for the content from Acts chapter 27. We're going to be in chapter 27. We're going to pick up in verse 13. And notice what it says. When a gentle south wind began to blow, they saw their opportunity. So they weighed anchor and sailed along the shore of Crete. Before very long, A wind of hurricane force called the northeaster swept down from the island. The ship was caught by the storm and could not head into the wind. Before we move on in the text, I want us to notice a particular phrase. Before very long, a gentle wind began to blow. They weighed anchor before very long, right there. Before very long. And also, zoom in on this in your mind, a wind of hurricane force. Remember that as we move along in the text. Going on, we were hardly able to make the lifeboat secure. So the men hoisted it aboard. They passed ropes under the ship itself to hold it together. We took such a violent battering from the storm that the next day they began to throw the cargo overboard. On the third day, they threw the ship's tackle overboard with their own hands. When neither sun nor stars appeared for many days and the storm continued raging, we finally gave up all hope of being saved. Incredible. Now, what you and I want to notice here in this first part of the storm text, there are two traits in a storm. First of all, there is a sudden trait to a storm. Storms come suddenly, without warning. That happened in this text. Remember that phrase, before very long? Before very long. They're just sailing along, and before very long, out of nowhere came this storm. They didn't have storm tracker apps back in the day, and all of a sudden, they're caught in, here's the second trait, a serious storm. Remember the phrase hurricane force. That's the word typhonicus in Greek. Typhonicus, it means, it's a word that means hurricane force, from which we get our English word typhoon. This was not just a low depression system. This was a serious, life-threatening storm. And we know that it was very serious because of the action that they took. Do you remember the phrases that they put ropes underneath the ship? That they threw the ship's cargo overboard? The very thing that they were transporting that was of great value went into the sea, the raging sea, in hopes of keeping the boat afloat. It said in the text that they even threw the ship's tackle overboard. Now remember, tackle, that's the rigging of the ship, the ropes, the pulleys, even some of the sails went into the raging sea. The fact of the matter is, all of a sudden, without warning, here came this life-threatening, serious storm, and Paul is caught in the midst of it. Now, before we go on any further, these two traits also remind us of two truths in a storm, particularly this storm. First of all, there is an unavoidable truth. Some storms are unavoidable. Joseph, for example, in the book of Genesis, Joseph is sold into slavery at the age of 17. That was something unfortunate to happen in his life, and God was going to use it for a great purpose. And we know that from chapter 50 of Genesis, when many years have passed, Joseph says to his brothers, chapter 50 in Genesis, verse 19, "You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good, which is now being done, the saving of many lives." So we need to understand that there are moments in life when you and I are suddenly caught in a serious storm, and it's not of our doing. It's unavoidable. God's got a plan. Romans chapter 8, verse 28, we know that in all things it is God who works for the good in your life and in mine, the lives of those who love the Lord and are called according to His purpose. So God will use circumstances for good purposes in your life and in mine. All things, in all things, God works for the good. We also want to remember that there are unavoidable storms and avoidable storms. So two truths, unavoidable, God's got a purpose, avoidable, we do it to ourselves. Example, David and Bathsheba. David could have avoided a great deal of pain and suffering, not only in his own life, but in the lives of the rest of his family, had he not engaged in a sexual assault of Bathsheba. So you and I need to see in this text the reality, once again, that the suffering, the loss that they incurred on that ship was completely avoidable. Here in the text, much time had been lost. Sailing had become dangerous because it was now after the Day of Atonement. Notice this, Paul warned them, "Men, I can see that our voyage is going to be disastrous and bring great loss to ship and cargo, to our own lives also." So Paul told them that what they were about to do was stupid. Don't do this. We could avoid great loss to ship and cargo, even to our own lives. Do not sail, Paul warned them, but they went ahead and did so anyway. Now, let's go on in the text here. Let's keep reading. Verse 21. After they had gone a long time without food, Paul stood up before them and said, "Men, you should have taken my advice not to sail from Crete." In other words, I told you so. Paul is telling them this storm, this loss, was completely avoidable. There are moments in your life and in mine, the decisions that we make, the words that we speak, the attitudes that we espouse, are going to bring repercussions that are not pleasant into our lives. Avoidable storms. All right, now stay with me, because we're going to see how we can and must reach out. Let's go on in the text. In verse 22 down through verse 26, Paul says, "But now I urge you to keep up your courage, because not one of you will be lost." Now, let's peek around the corner of this for a moment. We know in this 27th chapter of Acts that this wasn't a storm just for 1 or 2, maybe 3 days. We read in the fine print that the storm had been raging for 14 days. We read in the text that the sun and the moon, the stars, they were not shining. So, for example, during the day, there were storm clouds that kept the people from seeing the sunshine. At night, there were storm clouds. They could not see stars. They could not see the moon. And this was going on not for just 1 day or 1 week, but for 2 weeks, 14 days. And just imagine the wind, it's howling, and the waves, they're crashing over the side of that boat, causing these men, all 276 of them, to be in fear for their very lives. Now, let's go on in the text. So Paul is screaming, he's yelling in the midst of that darkness, "Not one of you will be lost, only the ship will be destroyed. Last night, an angel of the God to whom I belong stood beside me and said, 'Do not be afraid, Paul. You must stand trial before Caesar, and God has graciously given to you the lives of all who sail with you. So keep up your courage, men, for I have faith in God that it will happen just as he told me. Nevertheless, we must run aground on some island.'" We hear in those words 2 ways to reach out. Paul reached out in 2 ways. First of all, with an anchored faith. An anchored faith. He said, "I have faith in God." He didn't say to these 275 other men, "Hey, I have faith in the ropes that we put under the ship." He didn't say that. He didn't say, "I have faith in the captain of this vessel." He didn't say that. No, he's shouting through the darkness of the night, with the crashing of the waves upon them, through the howling of the wind, "I have faith in God." And he's urging them to do the same. He's pointing them to God. And he's reaching out, secondly, with an active faith. An active faith. He's pointing these men to God. He tells them no one is going to die because of the great grace, favor, mercy of God. And you and I, we can do the same. We have got to reach out to God ourselves when you and I are caught in a storm, whether it's of our own doing, completely avoidable, or whether it's not of our own doing, unavoidable. We need to reach out in faith, anchoring our faith in Almighty God, that He is bigger than any storm. Always remember, every storm passes. Every storm passes, and we need to reach out to others in hopes that they also will experience this same hope that is found in God and in God alone. You know, in Luke chapter 5, there's a paralytic, and he's on a mat. And what's interesting, his buddies take him to Jesus. They hear Jesus is in town holding a revival, and they're taking their buddy to him, and they can't get to Jesus because the house where Jesus is surrounded by people. And you might be that you remember the story. His buddies take him to the roof. They dig a hole through the roof, and they lower him on that mat in front of Jesus. And in verse 20, chapter 5, Gospel of Luke, it reads, when Jesus saw their faith. When Jesus saw their faith. You see what they were doing? They were reaching out to God to heal their buddy. Their faith was anchored in God. And not only that, but they were telling their buddy here by lowering him on that mat in front of Jesus, God's got this. They were giving away their faith. There was an act of faith. Can you imagine how disappointed he would have been when he's being carried to that house on that mat by his buddies, and they look up and the house is surrounded by people. They can't even get close to Jesus. Can you imagine how disappointed he would have been? So an act of faith and an anchored faith is one way that you and I can help out when we reach out. You know, this is an oil derrick in a storm-tossed sea. The sea is raging, and there are many people at work on that oil derrick. And these oil derricks, they are fitted with what are called life capsules. Life capsules. So when a storm approaches, people evacuate that platform by getting into one of these, a life capsule, and they seal that door, watertight door, airtight door, and then these are dropped into this raging sea. And they are safe as long as they stay in that life capsule. And then after the storm begins to abate, here come helicopters, huge helicopters that put down a cable, and they're able to pluck that life capsule out of the sea and fly the people, its inhabitants, to land where they can then be ultimately rescued coming out of that life capsule. They're safe as long as they stay in that life capsule. Friends, when a storm is raging, Psalm 46, verse 1, God is our refuge and strength and ever-present help in times of trouble. So you and I, there is now therefore no condemnation for those who are in Christ Jesus. When we are in the life capsule of Christ, when we are in the safe arms of God, making Him our refuge, storms may rage, storm surge may be real, but I'm here to tell you, we will more than survive. So in this season, when we can help out, one way we can do that is by being certain that we need to reach out. Please share this encouraging word with someone that you know could be encouraged when they hear this hope-filled news. Please share this post.